People always ask the question, what camera would you bring to a desert island? Personally, I think, what camera would I take into battle? People call the Mamiya m645 a workhorse. I call it my Warhorse. Hey there friends, Alex Laux here, and welcome back to the channel. Today I have another camera review for you, and the medium format camera that I always reach for, and one that should be very familiar to you, the Mamiya m645. So I'm here in downtown Cambridge, Ontario, the historic town of Galt, one of my favorite spots, and we're going to do some shooting, but first, let's take it back into the studio. We can go through some of the camera background and give you a brief tour, and then we'll come back here. All right, so I'll see you in a few. Founded in 1940, Mamiya is among the younger camera producers in Japan. Founded by a pair of inventors, they produced a single 6x6 folding camera that took 120 film. Unfortunately, in 1941, when Imperial Japan declared war and attacked Pearl Harbor, a lot of optical producers in the country were quickly nationalized and efforts turned towards the war. After the Imperial Japanese surrender of 1945, the US began to use the same model that Allied forces occupying Germany began to use and use the optical industry to rebuild the country's shattered economy. Mamiya would be the first camera producer allowed to restart production of their camera lines. Joining the Mamiya 6 would be a fixed lens 35mm rangefinder, the Mamiya 35, a twin lens reflex, the Mamiya Flex, and a sub-miniature camera, the Mamiya 16. These all started production in 1948. As the middle of the century came about, Mamiya tried their hand at a couple new things. The failed Magazine 35, a fixed lensed rangefinder with a hot swappable 35mm film back, and more importantly, the highly successful Mamiya Flex C, an interchangeable lens TLR. Of course, we all know what happened in 1959. Nikon released the F and changed the world forever, introducing the idea of a system camera. Well, Mamiya wasn't far behind. They would produce the Prismat in 1960, but it would have a hard time competing with the big names like Nikon and Canon. So Mamiya instead would decide to focus their energies on the medium format market and decided to start developing system medium format SLRs. These efforts would not be in vain. The first release was in 1970 with the iconic fridge, the Mamiya RB67. An SLR system camera that took 6x7 images on 120 or 220 films, and everything was completely interchangeable. Lenses, prisms, backs, you name it. And they would take these same things and develop a 645 camera. The Mamiya m645 first released in 1975. Along with the base body, Mamiya released a series of lenses, multiple finders, including a metered prism, and even one that offers aperture priority, semi-automatic exposure, grips, and a motor drive, as well as several different inserts, mostly aimed towards 120 and 220. These cameras were designed for the professional photographers and quickly found their place within the pro-wedding photography industry. A year after the release of the m645 came an updated version, the 1000S, which topped the shutter speed out to 1/1000th of a second as opposed to 1/500th of a second of the original base model. And then in 1975, a stripped down or junior version, the m645J, was released. And it essentially was a standard m645 with a top shutter speed of 1/500th of a second, but lacked a top shutter release button. The m645J would be the first to cease production in 1982. The m645 ceased production in 1987, and the 1000S ceased production in 1990. But now let's take a closer look at the original m645. And here it is. This is the original M645 in the configuration that I normally would be shooting it in, with a waist level finder and a lens. In this case, I have the 80mm f2.8 mounted. So let's take a closer look at the camera itself. You have up along the top, you have your standard aperture ring. It moves and the focusing is really nice and smooth on this example. Continuing with the top, here is one of the best features I think with the camera, is this top shutter release button that really helps when you're working with the waist level finder installed. It makes life so much easier. You're not hunting for the front release button. And the nice thing about the front release button is that the two of them are linked and you have that mechanical shutter release. You also have a locking collar here that allows you to lock the shutter from accidentally firing. Also right here, one of the other problems I find, especially when working with this camera in the winter, is mounting and dismounting lenses. The lens release chrome button right here is really, really small. Continuing along, right up at the top here, you have your shutter speed dial, and you have shutter speeds all the way down to 8" plus B. You have your flash sync here and your top speed of 1/500th of a second. On the 1000S model, this is about the same, except it has that extra 1/1000th of a second added. Also along the side, you have two PC sockets. You have an X-Sync for a electronic flash, and you also have FP. This is for using flash bulbs. Yes, even in 1975, they still had the ability to use standard flash bulbs. Got to keep things backwards compatible. Now, this is a battery reliant camera. Thankfully, the batteries only really power the shutter. So until you actually press that shutter button, the camera stays off. So the batteries do last a long time. But to check it, you use this red button here. And if your batteries are good, this green light will illuminate right above the shutter speed release. Opening up the waist level finder, it is perfectly composed for 6x4.5, and by pressing a little silver release here, you have your magnifier here to help with your focus. Now, this is just a basic waist level finder. There are other ones that actually have an action finder that puts metal loops that you can flip up and sort of hold it up and compose it that way. On the back, you have your release for the waist level finder, and you can replace that here. On the back, you have your film back, and you press this memo card, pull it out, and lower it, and you have your film insert here. One of the weak points of the camera are the foam seals along the bottom. I really need to replace mine, but you know what? This duct tape's been working really well. On the bottom, you have your PX28 silver oxide battery, 6V, which is wonderful. It doesn't take a mercury. And you also have your tripod socket here and the battery release. You also, and on the side here, you have a mirror lockup function, multi-exposure, and probably the best part is the rapid winder and your frame counter here. But you know what? That's enough of this. Let's take this out into the field and actually get some film loaded and get shooting. There's a reason I work with this camera so often. As a medium format camera, it's lightweight and well balanced for field work without taking too much space, especially when you configure the camera with an 80mm f2.8 in the waist level finder. In fact, you could probably carry a complete kit with multiple lenses in your carry-on, and it doesn't take up too much space in most camera bags. Loading to the film insert is opposite from what you'd usually do with a TLR or similar camera, but it's easy once you get the hang of things. The one downside is that because the m645 uses inserts, you're limited to only 15 shots on a roll, rather than 16 with a magazine on the second generation cameras. Once in the field, the camera gets out of the way. The waist level finder, if you can find one, is bright and has a secondary magnifier to help with the focusing. You even have a top-mounted shutter release that makes it taking photos a lot easier. The camera has several eye level finders and waist level finders, including one that is metered, but it does make the camera a little awkward to use. But Mamiya did release an L grip that improves the ergonomics. But it is left-handed. Mamiya had a thing about left-handed accessories. Plus, having that grip in the eye level finder gives you a hot shoe and an accessory shoe for flash work, or to mount your Ravini Labs meter. There's also an auto winder, but honestly it's only added bulk, and usually the manual rapid winder works fast enough for any job you can throw at the 645. Probably one of my favorite parts about the Mamiya m645 is that it's a system camera, which means you can customize almost anything to exactly how you want it to look. So let's head back into the studio and we can see what sort of equipment that I use with my m645. So as mentioned, this is my preferred way of working with the Mamiya m645. Small prime lens, waist level finder, shoot from the hip, use an external meter like my Ravini Labs spot meter or my Gaussian Luna 6F. But sometimes you're working in a situation where you need something different. Shooting waist level is great as long as you're working in landscape orientation, but it's a little awkward when doing portrait orientation, especially if you're working a wedding. Now, the one thing that can definitely help with that, so when you're in a situation where you need that little extra control, you could get one of these. This is an eye level finder. In this case, it's a metered prism. Unfortunately, the meter is dead, but it does give you a hot shoe right on the top with an X-Sync contact. So if you have any flash that has this, it'll work just fine. It also works well with radio triggers if you're working in a studio setup. So once you pop that on, there we go. But the trouble is as soon as you get it like this, it becomes very, very awkward to hand hold. So what do you do in a situation like this? Well, again, Mamiya had the left-handed grip. So you simply lock that on. And suddenly you have a very, very nice trigger system. Now, the reason it's on the left hand is probably to make sure that your rapid finder is, your rapid winder is here. And they also produced a motor drive for this. Unfortunately, I don't have one. I personally find it has added bulk. But you know what? If I'm working on a tripod even, I can take this off and I have that eye level finder, because working with a waist level finder on a tripod, I find often hurts. And if you're working with larger, heavier lenses, like the 45, having that eye level finder certainly makes it super nice, especially if you're working at a wedding and you just want that. It's a lot easier to swing it up and shoot. Plus with this, you can add a hot shoe meter. All right, still got more to shoot. Let's keep walking. While many see the optics for the m645 as boring, I have a different view. While they may not have any special qualities, they produce wonderfully sharp images that give a certain look to the image's contrast. There are two different manual focus lens kits for the m645. There's the original C series, or Mamiya Seikor C. These will also put the aperture before the focal length. The trouble with these older C lenses, especially the 82.8, is that the aperture control spring wears out over time, especially if you're constantly flipping between the A and M modes for the aperture. But they still produce excellent images if they work, and don't worry about a replacement. The second series came out with the second generation 645 cameras and are denoted by an N at the end of the lens name. These are much newer and work flawlessly with the M645. If you're building a kit from scratch, look at the N series first. If you're looking to put together a fast 3-lens kit, try out the 45mm f2.8, the 80mm f2.8, and the 150mm f3.5. But of course, I cannot speak about the M645 without mentioning the 80mm f1.9, often held up as the best lens in the system. I had a copy. I found that, yeah, it was pretty interesting, but eventually it developed some haze on the inner and rear lens elements, and the replacement, well, is pretty pricey. Thankfully, all other lenses can be had for a small investment. The biggest trouble with any camera of this age and type is getting it repaired. Thankfully, this one is a little easier to fix than some of the more electronic versions that came later. So hopefully this doesn't die anytime soon, because the prices on these have seriously gone up. Did a quick check here on eBay, and most are going for over $600 today. You can find one with a prism finder for about $485. But the ones with the waist level finder are still super expensive these days. So it's truly unfortunate, because these are fantastic cameras, especially if you just want to get started on medium format. So let me know in the comments below, what is your favorite 645 camera? What's your experience with Mamiya? If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing, give me a thumbs up, and of course, hit that bell notification icon. Until next time, my name's Alex Laux. Remember, get out there, stay safe, don't lust after gear you don't have, shoot the stuff you have, and get to love it more. Cheers. Hi. Yes, you're a good dog. Yes.